Chiesa sedite. I'm the Roman Orthodox, but you can call me Roman or Magister Romanus. Either way, it's up to you. And today, I thought I'd share my sort of thoughts on the Pope, on the recent papal election that's coming up, on the conclave, and sort of some things that I've observed just watching the coverage from my own home. I bring to this not very much. I'm by no means a Vatican insider or anyone that's spent more than passing time with the Catholic hierarchy. Instead, this is just my take as a former Catholic who is now an Eastern Orthodox believer, and some things that I've sort of observed along the way. So I'm going to look at this from a few different perspectives. So, first, as many of you know, I'm a former Latin teacher, and boy, the joy of watching the sort of pre conclave services with tons of Latin and being able to follow along. So, this was always my favorite part of watching the conclaves. Of course, they come in the context of being sad about the passing of a previous pope. I didn't have much of a connection to Pope Francis in terms of, really thinking highly of him or thinking ill of him. I tried generally not to think about him at all. But this was by far a less mournful process for me than it was watching, say, the death of Pope John Paul II, which happened when I was in college, or the death of Pope Benedict XVI, which happened, uh, you know, just recently. So Pope Benedict XVI, of course, was someone that I felt very close to as a former traditionalist. He was very much of the same kind of thinking that I was when I was Catholic. I generally believed that um, if I wasn't quite maybe as sanguine as he was about the Novus Ordo, my thought was, well, it's probably best just to call off the fight, allow the traditional mass to continue, and eventually, things will work themselves out. So I had a pretty positive view of Pope Benedict XVI in most respects. And I even respected very strongly his decision to resign. I thought this was a good reflection of one of my favorite popes, Pope Celestine V, who resigned the office to go back to being a monk and suffered persecution because of that. But this one was not quite as heart wrenching for me. However, in the process, even with this current pope being kind of known as a modernizer, as a person of the people, nonetheless, the services, the Novemdiales masses in mourning, the pre-conclave services and prayer services of various types tend to be in Latin. So, as a former Latin teacher, I can really geek out about that and explain to my poor, unsuspecting cradle Orthodox wife all the meanings of the various hymns, and she just loves that. So, anyway, so as a former Latin teacher, it's a really interesting process, and it's a really interesting time for me. Um, as a former traditionalist, I have to say the conclave was always one of those moments when traditionalists took a very deep breath, especially those traditionalists that were still in some kind of communion with the wider Catholic Church. So, being from an FSSP community, the FSSP parishes, the diocesan Latin Mass parishes really depend on who is in office at the time as to whether or not they're going to be allowed, whether or not they're going to be encouraged, whether or not they're going to have to move out into the gym, as in the previous papacy. So every papal election was sort of weighted, you know, they everybody was sort of waiting with uh, held breath. Let's put it that way. They were waiting with anticipation to see who the next pope would be, because, of course, anything that came out of the Vatican was just sort of dissected to figure out if it was going to affect traditionalism, or if it was going to affect the traditional Latin Mass and that sort of thing. I do have to say that the SSPX, is not that worried about it. Neither are, of course, are the Sedevacantists, who think no matter what happens in the election on Wednesday, that a new pope is not going to be elected. So, the as a former traditionalist, I have to say, when the Pope died suddenly, I had this momentary freak out about the fact that the Pope was dead and that there was going to be a new Pope. It was quite something. My poor, again, cradle Orthodox wife was sitting there in the car asleep, and I was driving and listening to the radio, and I hear the announcement, Pope Francis has died. And I start tapping on my wife insistently. And I'm like, honey, 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 the Pope died, the Pope died. And I have to admit that for a solid half a second, I probably forgot that I was Orthodox. So, it was one of those, old habits die hard. She woke up, she said, yeah, didn't you see the news? And I was like, no. And she's like, yeah, the Pope died. That's really sad. And I was like, oh, yeah, I'm Orthodox now. I'm not that overly concerned with it. But yeah, so that was sort of my momentary lapse, I suppose, into my Catholic days, was getting sort of very upset and very distracted by the fact that the Pope had died and that a new Pope would be elected. I do have to say, I've been watching some of the Novum Dialis masses, and I made a point of watching the seventh Novum Dialis Mass. And for those of you who don't know, the Novum Dialis are the 9 days of commemorative masses, or 9 days of requiem masses that are said for the Pope. Now, with the previous two popes, I believe the previous two popes, at least one of those masses was an Eastern Rite of some variety. So I believe the first one was maybe Assyrian or Maronite. I'm not entirely sure. And I think there was a Byzantine one for Pope Benedict XVI. I can't remember exactly. But with Pope Francis, the Mass that was dedicated to the Eastern churches was very clearly a Western Mass, a Latin Rite Mass, said by the prefect for the dicastery of Eastern churches, the very Eastern sounding name, Cardinal, I believe it's Gujarati. And I thought, this is kind of perfectly symbolic of what Eastern Catholicism really is in the Roman Catholic Church. And I know I don't usually get too spicy with my opinions on this channel, but, frankly, the sort of propaganda that you hear out there, which is that the Eastern Catholic churches are all their own independent churches and they're not really under Rome, they're with Rome. Well, no, they're actually all governed by a single department or dicastery of the Roman See, and they happen to be headed by an Italian cardinal right now. And so they're one day in the sun in this whole process leading up to the election of a pope was just a normal Novus Ordo Latin Mass, which I believe was even recited in Latin. I was watching this and seeing all the Eastern Catholic bishops and priests and so forth coming into St. Peter's, and just thinking, oh my goodness, they must be, the inner groans must be almost audible. Having to put up with this. And the reality is that the Eastern Catholic churches, they're just a single department in the Catholic Church, in the Roman Catholic Church. They're run by an Italian cardinal. They are barely a blip on the radar as far as actual considerations for the Catholic Church. If they are important considerations, it's usually because of where they're located. They tend to be located in some hot spots. But right now, like even in the Middle East, it's not the Maronite patriarch that's sort of front and center in terms of the Middle Eastern peace process. It's the Crusader era holdover of the Latin patriarch, a very Italian man by the name of Pizzaballa, who is, kind of fronting the Catholic Church's actions over there. So, you know, this idea that you have equal, Eastern Rite churches in the Catholic churches, to me, absolute nonsense. Anyway, I digress. So, in terms of the upcoming election, what can we expect? I have to say, my favorite scene every time there is a papal election is just right when the conclave starts. You have this very traditional sort of prayer service or invocation of the Holy Spirit, where the cardinals and the Sistine Choir sing the Veni Creator Spiritus, beautiful, absolutely beautiful piece and beautiful melody. And they'll chant that together, and there will be a prayer, and they'll take the oath of secrecy, and they'll agree to abide by the rules of the conclave. And then the papal master of ceremonies sort of walks everybody out as he proceeds to the door of the chapel and then closes the door. And that's when the conclave begins and the voting begins. So I always find that moment sort of very poignant. That it's at that moment that they're sort of locked in, they're sequestered, and they're going to make a decision as to who is going to be the new pope. Lately, the elections have not been taking that long, usually about 2 or 3 days, and a new pope is elected. It's, a far cry from the weeks and so forth that it used to take. And perhaps the biggest contributor to that is the fact that social media exists, and quick communications exists. So it's possible, I guess, for the cardinals to form opinions well before they start the conclave. Anyway, so who could it be? Who could the next pope be? Well, I mentioned Cardinal Pizzaballa, who is located in the Middle East. He's kind of distinguished himself as a diplomat in this circumstance. I wouldn't be surprised if he is on the radar as a papabile. It'd certainly be a very poignant and symbolic choice. I'm no good at predicting elections, not even American ones. I guess if I were to put forward a prediction, I would say Zuppi. He seems to have kind of the right mix of qualifications, including, we might say, he's doctrinally, he's kind of on the left, we would say. And I would say that's probably the composition of the Cardinals. But he is a little less rock the boat than Pope Francis was. So if there is a swing of the pendulum against the sort of radical change that Pope Francis instituted, then maybe Cardinal Zuppi would be a good choice for that. Some people have said there might be an Eastern Catholic Pope this time around. I don't really see that. I mean, I suppose anything is possible. And then you get a really interesting question. Well, is this Eastern Catholic prelate going to start celebrating the Novus Ordo Mass and wearing Latin vestments and sort of completely change his colors? I don't know. It would seem kind of odd if he didn't, becoming the Patriarch of Rome. But in any case, I suppose it's anything is possible. But it doesn't seem like the Eastern Catholics really have that many notable characters. Some people say how do you say his name? Paraulin. And It seems like there's Parolin. I'm probably butchering his name. It seems like there was a few like movements in that direction, and there's been a lot of blowback in terms of his history. Seems he was a bit too much of a Vatican operator. So I don't know. Like I said, I am no good at predicting elections, even elections that matter to me. Um, but if I were just to put 15 cents on a bet, I would probably say Zupi. We'll see. It might be Tagle over from the Philippines. Who knows? I'll be as interested as all of you are in finding out who the final name is. Um, there are some things that I think personally I would like to see happen in the next papacy as far as between Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholics. Everybody prays for reunion, of course, but reunion in truth and not in compromise. So, um, but what could we honestly hope for? I think one of the biggest things that we saw in the previous papacy that was real progress was sort of acknowledging the historical forgeries and falsehoods that ultimately led to Catholic claims of papal supremacy. I would like to see the Catholic Church continue down that road. I don't know that it can or will, but it does seem to me like increasingly the Roman popes are acknowledging that their own claims aren't quite as historically rock solid as they used to proclaim. And in order for there to be any real progress between the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church, there's going to have to be a recognition of the difference between primacy, which still exists in the Orthodox Church in terms of the ranking of the various sees, um, and supremacy, a la Vatican I. And in some ways, Vatican II as well, since Vatican II and what followed were really raw exercises of papal power. So, it would be interesting to see if the Catholic Church continues down the road of sort of, we might say, pulling back on their extreme papal claims. I wouldn't be surprised if we see that. I think there's always a downside to that, though. It seems like those who are most willing to acknowledge some limitations in the Catholic Church's universality are nonetheless the most insistent on their own power over the Catholic Church. So a lot of times it seems like the people who actually insist on the majesty and all the authority of the office are the ones that use it the least, because they view themselves as custodians of a tradition rather than the dictators of it. So it does strike me that there's a potential downside to that as well for Catholics, but for Orthodox Catholic relations, maybe something like that would be preferable. I think the interesting developments on synodality are something to watch. I don't think that the Catholic Church quite understands the meaning of that term. Um, they talk about synodality as being this, we might say, harmony of the various orders in the church, the laity, the priests, and the bishops, and so forth. And this idea of having a church that listens, right? And so they had this synod on the synodality of the church. And what struck me is that the structures that resulted were mainly about listening and about experiencing and about walking together and all of those sorts of things, and not really about having a synodal church in the sense that the early church would have understood it. And the early church, for them, synodality meant the fact that no bishop governed on his own, and that ultimately, even the top bishops, the patriarchs and so forth, were responsible to their synods of bishops. And so I think the idea of synodality is interesting if it results in a more consultative organization for the Catholic Church, but it's getting nowhere near the concept of synodality that really is the characteristic of the early church and of the Orthodox Church today. So I don't think they've quite got the notion down, but it would be interesting to see how that develops and whether we'll see sort of some democratic structures develop in the next papacy, sort of following in those footsteps. I don't know. But all in all, the experience has been kind of, I don't know how to put it. It's been almost alienating. It's been very strange to watch this process unfold for me as a former Catholic and a former traditionalist Catholic. I practiced Catholicism for most of my life before becoming Orthodox, or most of my Christian life before becoming Orthodox. And for me, during that time, the Pope was this sort of central figure in my faith. And you can see the faith and the passion and the connection that the Roman Pope has with his congregation. I think it's very interesting to see the sort of celebrity and the level of trust and prayer and concern that happens from Catholics, that happens among Catholics when a new Pope is to be elected. Certainly there is, you might say, notoriety. There is interest when a new patriarch of Moscow or a new patriarch of Serbia, or the recent election of the Bulgarian patriarch, I know, was very hotly followed, or whenever there's a new ecumenical patriarch. But frankly, I think the fact is that Orthodox bishops, Orthodox patriarchs, are more seen as remote governors of the church than people that are like passionately followed, right? I certainly love my Patriarch John. He has some wonderful qualities and wonderful teachings, but when it comes time to elect a new patriarch, I might, I guess I might fanboy a little bit, but it's not going to quite have the same effect as the election of the Pope did for me as a Catholic. So I find it very interesting. I do tend to see that the election of the Pope is an interesting cultural event for a lot of Italian Catholics, if not maybe quite as pious of an interest, more of like a political, social, cultural interest. But maybe I don't know anything about that. It's just an observation that I thought of the other day. What is the actual view of this in Italy? Outside of all the visitors who are concerned about who the new pope will be. Anyway, those are my thoughts on the papal election. I know they were a little bit a little bit meandering, a little bit off the cuff. That's pretty much all I can manage these days. I apologize. But yeah, I think it's very interesting times, and I'm looking forward to seeing who they pick. And if I get Zoopy, let's just say this. If I get Zoopy, if you are not subscribed to this channel, then be sure to hit that subscribe, like, share button, all of those things. If I get it right. If I don't get it right, then you need to subscribe to find out if I can ever get a prediction correct in an election. So, hit that bell, subscribe, do all the things. And with that, I will say, Kalispera. Thank you all. Adiosas.